You want? Okay. Okay, we are going to get started, folks. Thank you all for coming out on a Monday afternoon. It is my pleasure to welcome Dan Honig to join us in the conversation about bureaucracy and government and ways in which to make those two things work better. So for those who don't know, Dan Honig is a professor both at University College London as well as at Georgetown University, where he studies public policy and government. And so hopefully we'll be able to maybe at some point talk about the different perspectives from London and Washington, D.C. about the future of government here. His most recent book, which we'll talk about today, is Mission-Driven Bureaucrats. It's an excellent read. We're past Christmas, but if there's a loved one in your life who's having a birthday anytime in the future,
appropriate for every season, you know, a little mid-April gift, there's someone in your life who deserves one.
And so it's a wonderfully written book about individual government officials who try to make public services work better. In addition, Dan also serves as the principal investigator on the Relational State Capacity Project, which is run out of University College London. We had a terrific discussion about this during lunchtime with the faculty here at the Ford School. Dan and I were briefly colleagues at the McCourt School, and we are both part of the Better Government Lab, which is interested in finding ways to make government services work better. And outside of his work as a researcher, Dan has also worked in government for a while. He was a special assistant and then advisor to successive ministers of finance in Liberia. And he has also studied government in a variety of settings, including, and this is probably an incomplete list, Bangladesh, East Timor, India, Israel, Liberia, the Netherlands, Senegal, Somalia, South Africa, South Sudan, Thailand, the UK, and the US. So quite a list there. And most importantly, Dan is also an alumni of the University of Michigan. And so it is always valuable and important to welcome back our alumni who have done great things in the world. So I'm going to ask a few questions. We'll chat for probably about 40 or 45 minutes, and then I will open it up. I have some questions that were submitted online. We do have an online audience, and I'll sort of update those. But I'd really love questions and input from you as well, because we are bringing Dan here on campus as part of a broader series about policy and democracy, and at a time when the study of bureaucracy, which was sort of a boring sideline for much of us working within public administration or political science, has become incredibly central to public debate about the nature of our government and what we want presidents and cabinet officials and individual bureaucrats to do. So great time to be writing about mission-driven bureaucrats. So have your questions ready. We will have a little bit of a back and forth, and we'll keep it informal and conversational. But let me start with a couple of questions for you, Dan. So who are the mission-driven bureaucrats that you wrote about in this book, and why did you decide you wanted to write about them?
Yeah. So first, thank you so much for the warm introduction, Don. It is just so wonderful to be back home, which is how it feels to be here. To be back in America's greatest state, talking about what I think is America's and the world's greatest challenge at the moment, which is how we support and help all the many who care so deeply about helping the public, how we help them, in fact, do that, in fact, help the public. And I guess that's at core what I mean by mission-driven bureaucrats, right? So mission-driven bureaucrats are folks who work in the public sector who want to accomplish the thing that their agency or team or organization does. The word bureaucrats is intentional in the sense that, a lot of folks, as I started to do this work, said, call them public servants, call them, innovators, entrepreneurs, they're policy entrepreneurs, that's what they are. And sometimes they are. But what the word bureaucrats means is somebody who is typical of those who work in a bureaucracy, right? And to be mission-driven is not exceptional. It is typical, right? So the vast majority of people who work for the public good, who work in the public service, do that because they are drawn to what they do. And that's why they enter, that's why they remain. And why write this book? Well, I guess in my work, so you very kindly framed in a number of the places I've wandered to, after I left Ann Arbor. I guess in each and every one of them, I found dedicated public servants who were usually the primary answer to why things were going as well as they were, or as unpoorly as they were, where maybe they weren't going so well, But in either case, they were a force for good. And, I would be involved in policy conversations, and it seemed like we almost always missed the humans inside the system. We almost always treated those who worked in the public sector as if they were part of the problem, not part of the solution. And that felt to me likely wrong. And so I wanted to do the research and build the evidence base to, frankly, see if I was right about that and how generally it held. And if I was, to help put forward the message that only by caring about and supporting and enabling those individuals are we going to get the public services that we deserve.
Can you give us an example of one or two of the mission-driven bureaucrats that you write about in the book?
Absolutely. So let me give you two bureaucrats from very different places, right? So first, how about Labanya Margaret, right? So Labanya was the answer. So when I worked in Juba in South Sudan, Labanya, so my work involved a lot of trying to figure out what was really going on so we could craft policy solutions. Let me put it in broad terms, right? So that often involved so we'd look at the census data, right? Try to figure out what that told us about the world. Then we'd go out and see what was really true, right? This is true in many countries. Usually, particularly in, that part of the world where administrative data is usually weak, censi are usually not very accurate, right? But in South Sudan, time and time again, the data was pretty good, And I started to think to myself, how could this be? This is a country the size of France that's been a country for about 6.5 minutes, right? How did they end up with a pretty accurate census of all things in this very fragile state? And as far as I could tell, the answer, when I started to ask enough questions, was Labanya, right? So Labanya, the inaugural director of South Sudan's census, instilled in everyone who worked on the census this sense that this was the most meaningful thing that one could do, right? When I went and interviewed her to make a profile in the book, she said, even when God was creating, he must have used statistics. Numbers change people's lives. And I love it on two levels. So first, I am actually a faithful person, but I'm not sure God needs statistics. I'm pretty sure he could actually just know directly, depending on what one's beliefs are. But even putting that aside, what matters is that she believes it, right? And what matters is that she conveyed that sense of purpose, that sense that the way to make South Sudan better was with data to everyone on her team. And thank goodness she did, because, how exactly would you go the other way? So, the book sets up a dichotomy between managing for empowerment and managing for compliance, right? And if instead we were going to manage for compliance, we were going to try to monitor and targetize and check our way to make sure that people did the right thing, how exactly would you do that with the census in South Sudan? You would need a second team to go just behind the first team to make sure they did the right thing, because there's no baseline to compare it to, right? Empowerment is the only way that you could possibly get anything like reasonable data at reasonable cost, right? So very different context. When COVID came, and this is actually how the book opens, I found myself in Senegal doing research for this book, right? A couple weeks later, so Senegal closed its borders, right? So no flights in and out, no ability for private vehicles to travel. So a couple of weeks later, the State Department organized Operations Medicine, organized a flight, right? And my family and I, along with many other scared Americans, flew towards the pandemic in America, right, on Operations Medicine cargo planes. I should say, by the way, this is nowhere in the book, I'm not sure I've said this publicly, the plane was from Kalita Air, which for some of you very, very hardcore Michiganders, Cami Kalita, an NHRA drag race champion from the 80s and 90s, who is himself a Michigander. So flying on this Kalita Air flight back to America, right? The operations medicine guy who got up and started talking to us, right? Was kind of explaining the rules of the flight. He's wearing full protective gear, right? A lot of scared citizens looking at him. And at some point, somebody asks, how long have you been doing this? And he's like, well, actually it was Liberia. I was in Liberia yesterday, and I was in, I don't know, Ethiopia 2 days ago, and we've got like 5-hour turnarounds. We're not flight attendants, so please try to keep it clean. And somebody else says like, do you get paid overtime for this? He says, no, I'm a government employee. And then he paused and he was like, look, I'm honored to do this. This is why I took the job. I want to help you and everyone be just as safe as possible. And, somebody started clapping, and then somebody else joined in, and all of a sudden there was a plane full of people clapping and celebrating this man who I later learned was named JR, right? And as we applauded him, my wife turned to me and said, this goes in your book. And I said, it does. It does. You're 100% right. It absolutely goes in the book. And she was right about that too, as she is so many things. And when I went back and interviewed him, right, what he said, when I asked him why he was there, what led him to that place in his life, deep sense of commitment, family devoted to public service, largely military service in the U.S. I asked him about how he was managed, right? What the team felt like, right? And he said, it's because I get to feel like I contribute, like what I do, like what I say, like what I want matters. I mean, if I didn't feel that way, I wouldn't be there. I wouldn't work there. Nobody would, right? And that's right. If we want mission-driven bureaucrats, if we want those folks to be in front of us in times of crisis, we need to build a managerial environment that lets them feel like they can do good things, because only then will they be there. We can't respond to the crisis by going and looking for them. We need to make it the case that they feel that they can thrive in the environment, in the normal managerial space, in the normal work of the agencies they do.
So this seems to be sort of the central lesson or mission of the book, is to think about two different strategies for managing public officials. One is to load up on rules and focus on compliance and make sure they don't do anything wrong. The other is to give them space, empower them, and motivate them that way. Could you sort of say more about what that lesson should be for the people who are either designing civil service systems or leading government agencies as they think about how to make the public service just more effective and responsive to the public?
Yeah. So, and that's exactly right. This kind of compliance empowerment dichotomy, right? So, and I frame it as a dichotomy. I should say, of course, in real life, it's not like you're choosing management theory A or management theory B. You're figuring out what to do, and the right solution almost always is going to involve some of both, right? But now we have a system that very frequently involves very, very little. I might say often it involves preciously close to none of the kind of empowerment side of the house, right? So empowering managerial practices being those that allow autonomy, that cultivate competence, the sense that I'm good at something and I can see that result. It matters that I'm there, not somebody else. Creates connections to peers and purpose, right? I guess what I would say is that the way you framed it is exactly right. If you want to minimize the chance of anyone doing anything wrong, the way to do it is to monitor them as much as possible, right? It is true. There is no better way to prevent $3 in the federal government budget from going missing than by making everyone account for every penny at a transaction cost of millions of dollars. Mm-hmm. But you will minimize the chance of the $3 going missing, right? If, on the other hand, what you want to do is actually, have performance, right? What you want to do is actually deliver welfare to citizens, make people's lives better, right? If you might think that's what government might be for, then I think what the empirics in the book demonstrate, and I should say, by the way, this is not one of these academic books where if you pick it up, every page is the research Dan Honig did, right? So like, pulling from as much research as I knew existed and could find in the world that was relevant to this topic, I think what we know, what that corpus tells us, is that we almost always have too much compliance and not enough empowerment if our goal is not minimizing the chance of that $3 going missing, but rather maximizing performance. And so what do I want to tell policymakers? From your friend, it echoes people like your friend Jen Polka, your own work, of course. What I want policymakers to know is that there's a real choice here. You can either help government perform better, or you can minimize the risk of anything going wrong, but you can't do both those things, right?
Now, when you put it like that, it sounds very sensible. But on the other hand, it feels like you are making an argument that's pushing against the wind in some respects, in that currently we have a lot of discussion about the risks of corruption and fraud, and obviously you've also worked in lots of places around the world where maybe we assume that there's a certain level of fraud in public services, and you have to try and stamp that out before you can build anything good. So why do you think that conventional wisdom exists? What is the knee-jerk reaction that makes us think we have to first impose a bunch of compliance and a bunch of controls in order to make public services function?
Yeah. So first, I'll answer the question you asked, which is, why do I think the conventional wisdom exists? Then, if it's okay, I might say a little bit about why I think that wisdom is dead wrong, right? Sure. So why do I think it exists? Well, first I think it exists because there's a kind of natural, I see something going wrong, I want that thing to stop, right? I am aware that this is a problem. It's kind of like, so the cost of too little compliance is things that look like fraud, right? That are fraud. I shouldn't say look like, that are fraud. Fraud is bad. I'm not saying it's good. Fraud is bad, right? I'm opposed to it, right? The cost of too much compliance is that good stuff that would have happened never happens, right? And it's pretty hard to observe what would have gone right if we had set up the system differently, but didn't. And so we have like a really hard to make visible and legible gain against a really easy and already visible and legible loss. And the system responds to the loss. So that's one, I think, reason for the conventional wisdom. I think the second reason is that, many politicians, I know we have a reporter here from the Michigan Daily, right? So, fear of what is the Daily going to say about my, what is the paper going to say about my administration, right? What is that headline going to look like? If we gave, I am willing to posit that if we gave 100 school districts in Michigan more autonomy and more empowerment, right? So not just, active management that supports teachers, that supports administrators. I think my guess is that the vast majority would use that autonomy and empowerment in ways that improve the educational performance of students, right? Some of them would use it in ways allowed by the rules, right? But that did not actually improve performance. And maybe a few of them, we would get some acts of misgovernance, of fraud, right? Let's say we had all of those results perfectly visible, right? The headline in the Free Press is not going to be 85% of schools improve performance for fourth graders. It's going to be I'm not going to name a real city, I was about to, four administrators in made-up city, right, stole money from the school budget. And then the very next thing that's going to happen, I would predict, is that we would get the state, education leadership to say, you know what, we are going to make sure this will never happen again. And the only way to make sure it will never happen again is to prevent the autonomy, prevent the discretion that allowed the net good thing to happen. And so, I think we need different policy frames if we want this. So why do I think this is entirely wrong? So one is because I think we don't do a good job of aggregating those wins and those losses in the way I was just talking about. Another reason I think is entirely wrong is because you were talking about places where the monitoring environment is not as strong as in Michigan, right? Let's say Liberia, right? So I was doing an interview a few months ago, and the interviewer very tentatively was like, but possibly not everyone in the Liberian government at all times might have been devoted to, and I said, yes, I see where you're going. So I was the chief of staff to a Ministry of Finance where all of the appointees of the Ministry of Finance had been appointed by Charles Taylor and his allies, right? These people did not get their jobs because they were meritocratically selected, people who were deeply devoted to the public service. They got these jobs because they were there to help rebel groups steal money from the state, right? We do not need to worry about whether these people were selected because they were bad type agents. I'm telling you, they were selected because they were bad type agents. They are about the worst motivated public service I think we could imagine. If you have another example, I'm all ears, provided I would love it. But I can't imagine how it would be worse. What did we find in Liberia? Well, guess what? We also couldn't know what anyone was doing, right? Those same contexts where fraud is more prevalent are also contexts in which monitoring is weaker, right? If we could do a thing where we got no fraud and also perfect, we would choose the world of high performance, high equilibrium, high motivation types every time, right? But even when we don't have those types, right? We need to use the tools we have. The job of a good manager is to say, here I am, what's going to make things better or worse from where I am, right? And, that often in Liberia wasn't, let's take Charles Taylor's money man and give him an unrestricted budget, right? But it often was, let's involve public service in making consequential decisions. Let's involve people in getting on the team of being part of progress. And even people who were appointed because they were bad types very often were able to do good work, and performance certainly rose as a result. I should say, I know I've given a long answer here, but just to add one more case on this, in the book there's a profile of Judy Parfit, who ran human resources for the South Africa Revenue Service right after the end of apartheid, right? A lot of revenue officials who were aligned with the National Front, who were aligned with the old regime. You might think we have to get rid of these people. That is exactly the opposite of what Judy and her team did. Instead, they took people who had been deeply opposed to Mandela's South Africa and helped them buy into this image of the new South Africa and accomplished much more. Turned the South Africa Revenue Service into, for many, many years, a kind of model for the continent of how to do one's business.
So you have lots of really great examples from different settings, but part of me is curious whether you feel confident that it's actually possible to compare really different histories, different contexts, to draw these conclusions and say, in general, empowerment is better than compliance? Or are they really too different, like the US is too different from Liberia, Israel is too different from the United Kingdom? So should there instead be sort of a theory of governing that's specific to a context and specific to a history of that setting in which it arises?
Yeah, so I guess I would say that, in every other argument, so first let me say I don't think the same level, so whether you want more or less empowerment depends on where you are, right? So my theory is not that we always want the most empowerment we possibly could have, right? Where you are depends on deeply contextual, right? Every other thing I've ever written says, well, in situation A, we probably need more X, and in situation B, we probably need more Y, right? Here, I'm not telling you that story, right? I'm telling you that, our default assumption should be we need more empowerment relative to where we are. The reason for that is that despite what I agree are deeply different contexts and histories, I am unaware of empirical evidence that pushes towards more compliance being a better solution than more empowerment relative to where a particular agency or government is systematic. I'm not saying it's never happened in an agency, right? But as a general default, right? So, the way you articulated that theory, so Frank Fukuyama, who we both know well and some in the audience will know, a number of years ago, he articulated just such a theory, right? His example of a place where we need less autonomy and more rules was Nigeria. And that is not an unreasonable place to have chosen as a place to articulate such a theory about. It just so happens that then people went and did empirical work in Nigeria, right? And related work in other countries, including Ghana, not far away, by Martin Williams, and with some of the same co-authors, speaks in the same direction, right? And what they find is that actually it looks like there's too much compliance and not enough empowerment in Nigeria. If the cases that we ex ante would have believed are the cases where we would most likely see more compliance to be a good idea, the Somalias, the Liberias, the Nigerias of the world, right? If in even those cases we see the other being true, I'm not saying it's a universal prescription. What I'm saying is it should be the default diagnosis until proven otherwise. And I hope someday that we have enough evidence and enough nuance from enough places to be able to actually build the kind of highly context-specific theory you're talking about. Until we get there, I think we should head in the direction that our poor sextants, our current level of knowledge points to. And I do think that there's a kind of general answer there in lots of countries and lots of contexts.
I want to bring this back to what's happening in the United States in just a minute, but maybe this will sort of step us towards those questions. If in general, collectively we're better off giving bureaucrats more autonomy and more power, and in the reality, when we do so and one person fails out of 10, that's the one person who gets the attention, and that then encourages more compliance and more rules. I'm curious about how you build a politics of public sector success, a virtuous circle where you give autonomy, mostly good things happen, maybe some bad things happen, and then the public says, okay, that's what we want. Let's keep that going, recognizing we'll have some failures. And I think this is an important question because we're having these enormous discussions now about the role of government. In addition to what's happening in the Trump administration, there's this sort of abundance movement in sort of progressive, centrist, hard to define ways, which are generally, from a regulatory perspective, saying, we need to dial back the volume of regulations, yes, give governments more power to act quickly and decisively. When Secretary Pete Buttigieg was here earlier in the semester, he talked about this when he was Secretary of Transportation, just getting through all of the red tape. And so there are these interesting conversations and movements and beliefs, but I always have this measure of skepticism. Can we convert that into a politics of government success and the rewards for that success and rewards for empowerment? That seems like a harder lift than I can really clearly see how the single bad apple always leads to more compliance. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that. Like, is it possible for us to think about how to better communicate the value of empowerment?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think your skepticism is well-founded. Right? So I think this is a hard thing to do. But I actually think, so first let me say I think we see examples of it working well in lots of polities, though not often in really big countries, right? So, small countries, the Taiwans, the Singapores of the world, we see this working well. We see this working well at the local level in lots of places, right? Because at the local level, I'm aware that, okay, sure, that one person did that one bad thing, but I can see, I the citizen see, and I the mayor see, right? How shutting everything down as a result, it doesn't mean you tolerate it when you find the bad apple, right? You throw that bad apple out, but we don't imagine that we're going to make things better by treating everyone for their bad appleness, right? And I should say, by the way, it's a wonderful scholar named Jenny Mansbridge who once wrote that, sanctions-based accountability not only responds to distrust, it creates distrust, right? If you want to make somebody distrust you, treat them like they're someone you need to monitor and control in all ways, and you will induce in them the very behavior you meant to root out, right? People are not fixed types, they change, And I guess, how do we build this at a larger level? Well, I mean, to relational state capacity, and a little bit of what we were talking about at lunch, right? I guess I think that we are stuck in a paradigm right now where we imagine that what we're going to do is deliver to citizens and get lots of data and report up and show some scorecards and metrics, and citizens are going to say, oh yeah, that worked pretty well. Like, I saw it on the data dashboard. I'm convinced that's what I'm going to vote for. And I think what we are seeing in America and in places around the world, and I think not unrelated to the growth of populism and what I would call the fraying of the social fabric, is the notion that citizens are saying, this is not my lived experience, right? Things are not actually going better, right? And I guess I see that as a very sad thing. And I see our current administration to where it sounds like we might be turning as a troubling one, That said, I think it opens up the opportunity, and I hope it opens up the opportunity to build a new kind of politics, to build a politics steeped in the lived experiences of citizens, and that helps make the citizens human as seen by the state, and makes the people who work for the state human as seen by citizens, and leads them to understand that just the same way, you wouldn't excise, I don't know, a member of your community, or you wouldn't say no one can do it. If you knew 40 people and one of them did a bad thing, you wouldn't say, well, now we need to change the rules for the other 39, right? If we saw the state and citizens as humans to each other, I think there's a way of kind of reorienting what accountability is from this kind of channel all the way up, to one that's much closer to the kind of, the coal face. The actual interface between citizens and the state. And that's where I see some hope. But I'd be curious for your thoughts for what it's worth.
So I think one of the online questions that was pre-submitted asked about level of government and how that might make a difference, and whether it was easier to employ this sort of model at the local level where people can directly see the services and maybe know the person that they're engaging with. Totally. And so they have more direct experience. And so that seems like sort of a plausible hypothesis there. I do think this is where the comparative frame does seem to be generally helpful. So what we've seen since the 1960s and the 1970s is generally declining faith in lots of institutions, not just government, not just in the US, but in lots of places, although it does seem to be a little bit worse in the US. And I'm not sure what the solution is in terms of finding a rhetoric or a framework to reverse that process. And at the moment, it almost feels like it's accelerating in the other direction. And this does move us to talking about, I think, the Trump administration, where from my perspective, if you look at the language that they use when talking about the public sector and public employees, and when they use the term bureaucrats, it's usually prefaced by unelected or rogue, right? It is a language of distrust, which is embedded in a worldview that assumes or takes for granted the idea that anyone who is not elected is somehow illegitimately using public power in a way that's at odds with the interests of the public. And I think that is mostly incorrect, but they are now running the federal government and making some extraordinary changes. But partly I just wanted to start from analyzing this from the perspective of the rhetorical framing here that's operating, and whether it's possible, because we have lots of students who want to go into government, whether it's possible to find a way to recruit the next generation of mission-driven bureaucrats when they hear the president or cabinet officials demean many of the people that work for them and say, your services are not wanted, or that you're somehow associated with an organization that's enveloped in fraud. that feels like a break from, there's always been some measure of skepticism about government in America, and it's accelerated, I think, since the 1970s. But it feels like we're at a different equilibrium now. And I'm curious about, and you don't have to have an answer, but I'm curious about whether you see it as feasible at some point in the future to turn around to students like this and say, yes, actually, we still want your services and your talents in government, and you will have an opportunity to do the sorts of meaningful work that you talk about in your book.
So first, let me readily concede the point that it does not make it easier to recruit mission-driven bureaucrats when you make it clear to them that you have when you, the government, right, the leadership of the country, makes clear that you're deeply skeptical of them, right? And indeed, part of the point of the book is that if we give people the opportunity to do work that's meaningful, they will come and stay. If you do not give people the opportunity to work that's meaningful, they will go. And in fact, the case most on point on this in the book is about Child Protective Services in Wayne County, right? Where I find a kind of a managerial compliance regime that leads in our research to the people who are most devoted to helping kids being the quickest to exit Child Protective Services, because they find, very sadly, in Child Protective Services, a work environment that does not, in fact, let them help kids, right? So definitely, it makes it harder, right? But the way you asked the question was, is it feasible at some time in the future? I want to actually, at the risk of putting my, glass jaw out, say, I think it's feasible now, right? And what's my proof for that? Well, it is harder in America now than it was a month ago or 6 months ago, right? But I'm unconvinced that it is harder in America today than it was in, Somalia when I was working there, or Liberia when I was dealing with the Ministry of Finance, right? Like, I have never been anywhere where there were not a substantial number of mission-driven bureaucrats. And, in the book, I use like 3 archetypes, right? There's Bina, who is always mission-driven, right? Who always is deeply committed to the mission. There's Samir, who could go either way, depends how that person is managed, right? And then there's Peter, who can never be reached, right? And I agree that those proportions change in the midst of threat. But there are always at least some Binas, because I have found them everywhere I've gone, right? That is my reason for thinking that. And I think there are always quite a lot of Samirs. There also, by the way, is no country in the world where we have systematic evidence that suggests people who work in the public sector are less public-spirited than people who don't. Let me put that the other way. Every time anyone has looked in any country in the world, the people who work in the public sector are more public-spirited than the people who don't work in the public sector. And that includes places where the public sector is known for not being so fantastic, right? Where there is reputational damage, not reputational gain, to joining the public sector. And if that's true there, why shouldn't it be true here? I do think, though, that, the most talented people are the people with the most options, right? And they are thus the people who, in expectation, will be least likely to weather the storm, least likely to choose to enter a career which now feels fundamentally more uncertain than it did before. And so, we can talk about Binas and Samirs and Peters, but there's also, motivation is far from the only thing that matters, right? Technical skills, abilities do too. And I think, we will see a generational decline. I hope to be wrong about this, but a generational decline in the average talent of government. But even whatever the level of average talent we have, it will be the case that because the work government does is not the kind of work that can easily be monitored, measured, and controlled, we will still be better off trying to turn those Samirs into Binas and empowering the workforce to try to accomplish the best that it can for the American public.
I'm sure we'll have more questions about what's happening in the US. So before I open it up to the audience, let me ask one more, which is, so you're also at the University College London. You're sort of sit between 2 capitals. How are folks in London thinking about public sector reform right now? What does that involve? And are they taking notes from the US and saying, that's the model we want to emulate or desperately avoid?
I mean, I hear a lot of that. This Trump guy, we like him. We like the cut of his jib. Tariff. No, I don't hear that. So, I do have some involvement in public sector reform in the UK. I would say that, and Keir Starmer has been very clear about the idea that we need a better performing but more empowered public service to get there, right? And I think we're seeing a move away from the kind of regulation and rules dominating the system to something that allows for more flexible and adaptive ways of working, that thinks about ways of refocusing accountability towards citizens. There's in the coming, those of us who are the sorts of dorks who show up on a Monday night to hear a talk about bureaucracy will hear in the next few months about stuff going on in the UK under the umbrella of like test and learn, right? Test, learn, and grow. Let's experiment. Let's learn from what's happening. Let's spread those lessons. I will say that to the extent I'm involved in conversations on both sides, and I hear you in part saying, what does it look like? What is the view from London, right? Like, I often end up framing America as, the ghost of Christmas future, So if we stay the course, if we continue to believe that the best answers are going to come by taking the cleverest kids and putting them in a room, the Oxbridge graduates, the Ford and Kennedy School graduates, and letting them solve the problem in some technocratic way and deliver it through channels the public will never see and really can't be expected to reasonably understand, that what that is going to get you might be some studies that show some welfare gains, right? But it will not lead to a thriving democratic polity. It will not lead to something that feels resilient to growing populism. And thus, I think I would describe, there's a great podcast, if you don't listen to it, by Tim Harford called Cautionary Tales, right? And I would say that I could imagine an episode on American bureaucracy a decade from now. I think right now we're a cautionary tale. But I also think we're a cautionary tale that is not without hope. And I think that, I imagine we might turn there in the Q&A, but I think there are reasons for hope, even as there are so many for despair in the weeks and months to come, and that the strength of America's democracy is going to be a product not just of what all of us think, but of what all of us do over the years to come. And when I see a group of people devoted to thinking about different ways of doing things, that is what gives me the most hope. And I hope all of you as well.
Okay. Thank you. On that note, I am going to invite audience members to ask questions. We have a mic that we can rotate around. And I see Megan in the back.
Hi, thank you both for this wonderful chat. I am sitting here thinking how bureaucracy has an image problem, right?
Image problem.
An image problem. People refer to bureaucracy as this horrible thing. It is tying up all of the efficiency and the effectiveness. It should be bypassed and gone around. People should be entrepreneurs and innovators, not caught in the process. When in reality, the process of the bureaucracy was such an innovation in and of itself compared to the aristocracy, right? It was ruled by someone who was dedicated to a process to treat everyone the same. So I was wondering if you could comment on how we got to this place where bureaucracy is a bad word and how it plays into the mission-driven bureaucrats' identities. And in terms of like recruiting future mission-driven bureaucrats, people like our Ford School students or students at the business school, how do we make bureaucracy great again?
I love it.
A slightly loaded question.
It is. Do we want to take a few maybe, and then we can chat in around.
You just don't want to answer my question yet.
Okay. This is a pre-dodge, you gotta set it up. It gotta be a multi-stage. I'll come to it. And your name, sir, would be wonderful too.
My name is Salman. Thank you so much for doing this. I think a lot of conversation that has come up in this from this administration is that bureaucrats are lazy, and I think I switched from a corporate career to civil service, and I also thought the same, that bureaucrats are lazy and they don't do work. But as I entered through the service, as I worked through, I realized we work a lot. So there is definitely an image problem, but and it's a question for you because you've seen so many countries. I've seen that you actually presented at Pakistan too. How do we as bureaucrats portray our side of the story, that we are not lazy?
Thank you, Aman.
These are good questions. I'm going to have opinions about these too.
Maybe one more.
You spoke a lot about the role of citizens as well. And if you could expand on the role of the responsibilities of citizens in ensuring a functioning democratic government, small d.
Absolutely. And what's your name?
Linda.
Don. I mean, I want to hear these opinions so I can steal them, right?
We've become so used, and this is part of what I admire about the book, is you put bureaucrats front and center in a positive connotation, and that is a choice that you made, as you mentioned at the start of the talk. And we've become used to the term bureaucrat or bureaucracy as an insult, or as a synonym for inefficiency, red tape, and failure. Whereas, as you point out, if you look back at history, the bureaucracy, the sort of Weberian design of the bureaucracy, was a vast improvement on what came before, right? It did things like take power away from the aristocracy. It also formalized delivery of government services so that people were treated roughly fairly with one another and tried to minimize potential for favoritism and abuse of the law. And mostly what it replaced was a different version of government, which was sometimes patrimonialism. Right? That's like another Weberian term that we use. And part of the question is, what are we going to see next? Are we going to see some post-bureaucratic landscape, which is everything is run by AI and innovation and entrepreneurship, and it's amazing? Or are we taking a step backwards towards patrimonialism and political loyalty, favoritism, abuse of the law, where informality is used not to sort of innovate, makes things better, but is actually used in a way that is at odds with basic democratic values? I don't know how to sort of frame the question in a way that makes people appreciative of bureaucracy, or whether that handle has just sort of become such a diminished brand that there's no way to bring it back. But the point that you asked, or the point that you raised, has been made again and again by people who go into government, especially working from the private sector. And as long as they're sort of humble enough to look around at the complexity of government, they say, wow, this is much more difficult and complicated than I understood. There's like a famous piece by Donald Rumsfeld where he talks about how it's just simply harder to manage and lead in the public sector. And this is someone who had vast experience in both settings, and someone who I think was ideologically, somewhat skeptical of government. And so I think the degree of constraint that public employees are placed under is sometimes mistaken for the nature of bureaucracy themselves. And part of what I like about the message of Dan's book is that if you remove some of those constraints, it becomes easier to tell the story of successes. If we go back to a previous generation, President George Herbert Walker Bush, when he tapped Paul Volcker to think about public sector reform in the United States, he talked about good people trapped in bad systems, which is quite a different tonal presentation of the issue than saying that these are the deep state, or even from President Reagan, like what's the 9 scariest words in the English language? We're from the government and we're here to help, right? That sort of framing. I think being able to sort of acknowledge bureaucratic processes that, as Dan sort of points out in his book, accumulate naturally over time. Like the natural tendency towards bureaucracy is towards adding more layers, adding more requirements, finding ways to tackle those, empower people, then it becomes easier to tell the story of why bureaucracy is actually superior to many of the alternatives that are seeking to replace it.
What Don said. No. So it was beautiful, Don. Thank you. I agree entirely.
I'll go home now.
I also, yeah, exactly. Our job is done. And I would start, how do we make it better? So, just to kind of put a human face to it, Ahmad. So you said you're from Pakistan, is that right? So I'm honored to be an associate of Lahore University's. So I'm a LUMS, I'm part of Mabul al-Haq, whatnot. So, I was at a dinner many years ago where I was sitting next to Adnan Khan. So Adnan is now the chief economist for the United Kingdom's FCDO, Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, their foreign affairs agency and development agency. But before that, he was Pakistan's head bureaucrat, right? So he was the head of the civil service, or I believe. And so if not, he was deputy head. And we were sitting at a dinner, and a Pakistani woman approached, and she said to Adnan, tell me, when you had your job, in Pakistan, how much did you steal? How much did you take, right? And he's at dinner, and he's like, no, I didn't, ma'am. She's like, that is impossible. That cannot be true. She has a generalized anger towards the civil service, and she's taking it out on, I of course have not been with the man every day of his life, but somebody I know to be one of the most honest, most earnest, most wonderful people who I've ever had the pleasure of meeting, right? And when we say what happens, is it demotivating to treat bureaucrats this way? The answer is absolutely 1,000% yes, right? It absolutely is. And how do we get out of it? Well, in part, I think we personalize the bureaucrats, right? We make clear how they are human and we connect them, right? That is part of how we get out of the image problem. But it's also, in my mind, to a great extent, how we get out of the legitimacy problem. So you asked a question before that I didn't answer part of, right? Which was, what about this idea, this idea that only elected officials are democratically legitimate, right? So, I think there are at least two systematic errors we make about democracy. The first is the idea that elections are most of what it means to be democratic, right? I would say, following your remarks, that, what it is to be democratic is to be steeped in the demos and what people want and responsive to them, right? And, the idea that moving away from America today, I've seen plenty of examples of elected representatives who did not seem to have public welfare at heart, or not all public welfare, or even any public welfare at heart, right? I'm speaking not necessarily about America as I say that, right? This assumption, frankly, I am not interested in who won an election which complexly aggregates lots of different preferences over a single vote. I'm interested in what actors in the system are serving the public. What actors in the system are making life better? What actors in the system are helping the state, which is, by the way, all of us, right? All the humans who live there are part of the state, right? Is helping the state do what it is designed to do. Sometimes that is going to be the politicians, are in favor of those good things, and there are forces of a permanent state that are opposed to them. But there is no per se reason that is true. And the electedness or unelectedness is to me secondary to the, helpfulness or harmfulness of who wants what in serving the public and making lives better, right? That is my bottom line. And I'm going to end with Don. You talked about Reagan, right? Is it 9? We're from the government and we're here to help, right? So his 9 words, right? So Reagan, as my fellow Midwesterners will surely know, right, was from Illinois. And the statement actually was given at the Illinois State Fair, right? And what Reagan did immediately after, the next line in the speech is, I'm not going to get the next line verbatim, but it's something to the effect of, that is why we are going to take power out of agriculture bureaucrats in Washington and give it to local farmers associations, which we are forming here to figure out how to distribute funds. It is not an argument for smaller government, right? It is an argument for the state being composed of, representative of, responsive to citizens, right? And so it might mean fewer jobs in Washington, but it's actually not less state. You could argue it's an argument for more state, right? Just state seen in a different lens. And I guess, Megan, to come back to the question that I tried so hard to dodge, when I ask how do we fix the image problem, we make it clear that's government too. The things you like are government too, not just the things you don't. And, the folks, teachers are bureaucrats, public health officials are bureaucrats, bureaucrats aren't just the ones who you can't see, the ones without faces. Those folks are pretty good too, actually, but you don't know them yet. But the folks you do know, my favorite question, if I'm trying to get you to change your mind about the bureaucracy, is to ask, tell me about a bureaucrat you know. Anyone who works for the public sector, anyone who gets a public paycheck. And almost everyone comes up with people they like, people they respect, people they know. Guess what? On average, the folks you don't know are like the folks you do. And that feels to me not impossible to convince people of.
To your question on citizens, at least part of a response is that the bureaucrats are also citizens, right? And the political theorist Camp Stivers wrote a book called Government is Us, and I was reminded of it as you talked there. So most members of the public are not aware that 80+% of federal bureaucrats live outside of the DC region. They're scattered across America, or that about 30% of them in civilian, non-uniform work are military veterans. And so I think that humanizing face starts with recognizing who these folks are and where they serve. I was at the National Park Service this weekend in Utah. It was a fantastic experience. Had the opportunity to talk to some of the park rangers. That specificity of story, I think, in representing citizenship helps to reveal the state in a more humane and accessible way than the sort of bland, faceless bureaucrat that's such a prototype in much of our political discourse. A question over there?
It's a question or a couple of statements. I'm gonna hand this to you on a silver platter. My name is Dana, and I actually am a Treasury Department official. I work for the National Security Arm of the Treasury Department. I am here currently in this talk in my unofficial capacity, but the reason I was even in the building and happened to see the advertisement for this talk, which, thank you, it's fantastic, by the way, is because I was actually meeting with the career services folks to actually talk about creating a pipeline for U of M students into the Treasury Department and other parts of government. So the first thing I want to tell you all is we are not closed for business. We are certainly recruiting for the next generation of strong, smart, and mission-driven bureaucrats. It has gotten a little more complicated. That will hopefully smooth out soon enough, but please be patient. The second thing, I don't know, again, if this is a question or a statement so much, I really enjoyed and have experienced the dichotomy between the compliance versus empowerment. A challenge I see, and I point this out because I think students in universities have a responsibility separate from government. What I find as a manager and supervisor in the government, as much as you want to empower people, I find it is that people do not know how to solve problems as easily anymore. And so what I want to present to the students here is, if you can communicate your ideas, if you can not only be empowered from the managerial side, but be somebody who is an entrepreneur, who can present those ideas, how those ideas may save the government money. It's really as simple as that. And you'd be surprised how difficult that has become. And I have a lot of theories about why that is. But thank you again. I don't know if you have found that in your research. However, you mentioned it a little bit.
So let me talk a little bit about that. Respond.
We've two more over here.
On from the internet, which is just looking at, when you look at all these different layers of government, and you're talking about bringing bureaucracy to the state or to the local level, do you find a difference between how easy it is to empower people at different levels of government in yours? And I have another one, which is, if you empower, what are the dangers of those bureaucrats becoming politicized? And then what is the remedy for that within an empowered framework?
Maybe we'll take on those before we
Sure.
go back to the folks in the room.
Yeah, so I guess I would say, on the levels, right? So I think empowerment, useful everywhere, right? Again, relative to where almost every agency finds themselves, not because universally extreme empowerment is always the right call. I would say more likely to be a kind of political settlement that sticks at lower levels of government because of that direct observational experience that Don was talking about before, because of that ability to say, okay, I'm not just looking at numbers here, I can think about people and stuff, and I can kind of see the context in which the bureaucrats are working, right? That said, it can and does build out to bigger levels, right? And, there still are places where bureaucrats are heroes, right? So, I would say actually the H.W. Bush messaging that you suggested before, good people in a bad system, it feels not dissimilar to what I hear Keir Starmer saying today, right? There are still plenty of places, including sometimes Pakistan, where, the greatest hope a mother might have for her child is that they become a member of the formal administrative service, and we get those kinds of positive effects even at big national level. Politicization, so I'm going to make it worse, right? So if we empower people, we don't just have to worry about politicization. We don't just have to worry about, the person who wants to discriminate against some other group. We just need to worry about the fact that people making judgments make mistakes, and they make more mistakes when they have less understanding, right? So, if you are of a group, right, and people from your cultural context come and communicate to you, you understand in a more nuanced way, in a deeper way, what they are trying to communicate than people who are not part of your group, even if you mean no ill will towards the outgroup, right? You just understand less. And so an empowered system is one in which, when Don was singing the praises of bureaucracy vis-a-vis autocracy, right? He said something like roughly equal treatment. I don't recall the exact phrase, but something along those lines, right? And that roughness will get a little rough, right? We will need to think about, if people make judgments, that means people who are observationally identical may end up being treated dissimilarly because people have made judgments about them that sort them into different categories. Those judgments could be right. They could also be wrong. And so an empowered system is one in which we will need to think carefully about who the system is working better for and who the system is not working better for, which is something we are going to see over time. I think it is also a system in which, the reason I left this to the end, Dana, it is also a system where, judgment is a muscle, right? So in my view, to the extent we see a diminution in kind of exploring and problem solving, we're confusing cause and effect. We have a system that has taught you not to do that. And guess what? You haven't done that. And thus, when you, Dana, are supervising people who have never done that, they are less good at it than people who have previously done it. And so the question becomes, how do places like this, one of the things that has so impressed me about this wonderful day at this Ford School is the deep commitment I see here to the education not just of technical skills, but of faculties of judgment, of assessments, of using those talents to figure things out on your own. And guess what? When you figure something out on your own, it's clear that the answer you come to, whether it's about a particular client or a big policy problem, is one, it mattered that you were in the chair, right? It gives your work meaning when you see that. It's one of the ways, I've been seeing the sticker all day, right? It's one of the ways, there's a sticker on this computer here that says, democracy is a verb, right? And one of the ways it becomes a verb is through those kinds of actions, right? Through the sense that I'm being an active part of solving the problem.
I'd just add to that. I think for most types of jobs that our students will go into, a huge chunk of it is going to be the ability to write down an argument and then present an argument and then to be able to provide analytical support for that argument in a context that is going to be incredibly task specific, where you can't just throw it out to ChatGPT to tell you about the nature of a specific treasury problem or a foreign aid problem, where you really will have to wrestle with information and be skillful about constructing that. And that, hopefully that's part of what we do here. The other questions also are great. I think I'm maybe more generically skeptical than Dan about the state of the world. The positives about the state and local level, the sort of laboratories of democracy idea, I think has a downside where it's tied to the collapse of media coverage of state and local governments in the last 20 or 30 years, where you just don't have specialist state reporters in the Capitol anymore who know a ton about a specific policy area. And so you have less ability to read your local newspaper and know a lot about how government is working. And that is a relatively new phenomenon that I think is bad for state and local government. We're still at the federal government level, because it's such a huge entity, because we have still a very vibrant national press, we know a lot more about success and failure than we sometimes do at the state and local level. And the question about empowerment and politicization, I think, is a really good one, because it's very easy to hijack, say, some of the language that Dan proposes, or terms like flexibility, without asking flexibility for who and to do what. And certainly there are ways in which, in my opinion, the Trump administration is exercising unprecedented flexibility to shake things up and are disrupting. And you can use the language in very positive sounding ways without actually taking account of the consequences there, where I think which will be bad if you have lots of people leave and replaced by people with less task-specific knowledge, or not be replaced at all, or where you have 4 years from now a new administration overlooking maybe potentially 100,000 political appointees who have been reclassified from career service employees, and now they have to decide, are these still the people we want to keep working in our administration because they've been reclassified as political appointees? Some disruption is good, and some disruption maybe less so.
Hello, thank you so much for your discussion. It's been super interesting. My name is Maeve. I'm a senior in the Ford School. And my question is kind of related to something you said earlier in the talk about this kind of hypothetical about giving school districts autonomy in Michigan. And you were talking about kind of this hypothetical statistical breakdown about, like, What'd you say?
Yes, I was agreeing. I appreciated your hypotheticalizing.
Okay,
Yeah,
yes,
there's no
yes,
actual
of
data.
course, it's hypothetical. And this breakdown about like, the percentage, you'd have a large percentage that would show increases in kind of student outcomes, some that might be, hit or miss, and then some that would be a small percentage, but that would still be there, that would perhaps like make decisions that weren't in the best interest of the students or the teachers there and so on. My question is kind of from a political standpoint, how do you justify that? And kind of the language you used was interesting to me about like monitoring, because I think that like having the statistical data behind that, whether you do something with that or you just have passive statistics, are kind of it's like the first step in being able to actually quantify and like analyze what's going on. That also makes it an easy target because then you see, the amount of fraud and you can feel it. And I'm wondering from like a political perspective and this idea of like, bureaucratic image and how you justify that, like, what do you do with that? How do you kind of responsibly and humbly take fault for what's going on and what's going wrong? Because I think that's one of the issues that the Democratic Party has struggled for a really long time, where they justify government kind of by all means necessary, even when it's not working. But then how do you also kind of rationalize like all the good things that government does do? And how do you like serve that nuance to the public who honestly, most people don't care. Like they don't care about government. And so they don't care about how it functions and they read something that impacts them and that's where they get hooked and attached. How do you I know that's like a really loaded question, but that kind of hypothetical breakdown in the view from the public is kind of what interests me.
It's a really smart question, Maeve. I look forward to turning to.
Hi, my name is Derek. First of all, I'm sold. No further arguments necessary. I'm on board because I have been a bureaucrat. I continue to work with bureaucrats, and this resonates with my experience that often there are really good people who should be empowered, who are working really hard to make good things happen, and there are other people who are similarly motivated but end up discouraged and end up out of the system. So I'm bought in, and I think my question is really is in this rhetorical space of like, how do we get everybody else on board with that? And to that end, do you have examples of systems that have transitioned from a very compliance-based or compliance-oriented frame to an empowerment-oriented frame so that we might copy that model to hopefully not just make the argument, but actually make the transition?
Thank you. One more question, maybe? I think the gentleman right in front has a question here.
So my question is, so I'm from West Virginia, originally a very small rural state with a lot of public sector employees. And I'm trying to understand sort of what you think is the best way to reach folks who feel like the public sector hasn't reached out to them. But what's ironic is they depend a lot on the public sector. I mean, West Virginia has a lot of Medicaid recipients. It has one of the highest per capita veteran populations in the country. It seems very contrary, and I don't understand how do we get the message through whenever it seems like state actors at the local level are purposely disrupting the bureaucracy that supports that state.
What's your name, sir? Vincent. Don, do you want to take the first one?
Those are all really good questions, so I feel like I'm going to defer to you.
So, yeah. So, compliance to empowerment, the shift, Derek, that you're talking about, right? So, I think we've seen the shift a couple different ways. So, one is a shift that goes through what does the public actually want, right? So, I'd point to Audrey Tang's work in Taiwan, right? And which connects to the question before. I thought about talking about this in response to your question. This notion of coming up with ways of saying, what is the public actually interested in? And then saying, okay, well, we're delivering against that, right? We're doing, in fact, what people want about this thing, not relying on this, what development people would call the long route of accountability that goes all the way up to elected politicians and then all the way back down, and then the work comes back up and then goes all the way out. Instead, let's just have the citizens and the state talk a little bit more directly to each other. Right? The other place we've seen shifts from compliance to empowerment is on accident, as I learned to say growing up in Michigan, right? So on accident, in the sense that I look at a place like Thailand, right, where I have worked over the years, and some of that work is in the book as well. And in Thailand, formerly super hierarchical state, right? The people who run local districts are appointed by the central government, right? Your district education officer, appointed by Bangkok. Your district health officer, appointed by Bangkok. I won't do it 100 times, but your everything officer, appointed by Bangkok. And they're like, it's in the book, I don't recall, but it's like 800 some districts, right? So it's a fairly local level of government. What happened in Thailand is that in the kind of political churn of the last few decades, the center effectively lost control over what happens in districts, right? The districts started to cartelize and to realize that if we're in the district, the only thing we can get promoted is get promoted to Bangkok, which we don't want to do, right? It's going to be pretty hard to fire us. So let's just start doing whatever we think the best thing to do is. Let's treat this district team, right? And let's actually, in a very democratically unaccountable way, though one might argue that is true even in Thailand's current electoral regime, right? There's no alternative in some sense. In an unaccountable way, let's try to figure out what citizens want. I am not saying this is the best possible equilibrium for government. It is a shift from a highly compliance-oriented one to a highly empowerment-oriented one. And what do we see? Well, I can't go back and take surveys before the switch, but I can tell you that in my work in Thailand, if Thai bureaucrats were representative, they would be, this is comparing them to something called the Global Survey of Public Servants, which is a wonderful database for those of us who care about these issues. If nationally representative, they would be the most empowered and second most satisfied bureaucrats in the recorded world, right? In the data we have, right? Despite laboring in a system that pays them very little, where they have very poor promotion prospects, right? And where they have to deal with elite dysfunction at the top. And what have we seen to the performance of the Thai state? We've seen continued excellent growth. If you go to the World Bank Thailand page right now, it says something like Thailand is an exceptional development performer, arguably the greatest development transformation of the last 20 years, right? So I think we see this work at scale. I think we see this work in local places. But it tends to work at scale when it happens on accident, right? And the question is, how can we make it intentional? And that comes to your excellent question, Maeve. So, and Maeve, I don't know if you've considered becoming a minister, but I would say that, like, as you asked your question, you were like, I don't know, but then I would think about this, and then I would think about that. I was like, yes. You asked what is basically the most common question the policymaker endorsing the work of me and my team usually wants to know. And when I say me and my team, Derek, there are bureaucrats, there are leaders all over the world who want to transform, who want to shift towards more empowerment. But actually right now we also don't have support services for them. You want more compliance, you want a monitoring system. Lots of people will sell you that. Lots of consultants who help you out with that. You want to shift organizational culture in a direction of empowerment, figure out how to evidence it, figure out the messy reality of cultural transformation, you don't have a lot of places to turn. And so sometimes, so poor are your options, you may find yourself depressingly finding me and turning to me. And so, when that happens, at some point, I find myself in conversations with a minister or a deputy minister, or a director, whatever, who's authorizing this work. And they ask exactly your question, Maeve, which is, how do we ensure ourselves this will not go perfectly? And how do we make the reform robust to this, right? And, I think the first thing you do is be honest about it, is say, look, here's what we're going to do. Like everything, it's not going to be perfect. Unlike what I think has often been convention in this country and many others, we are not going to pretend that government is, or will be perfect, and that we will get waste, fraud, and abuse, to use the American term, to absolute zero. We will not. That's not because we don't care about minimizing waste, fraud, and abuse, but we care more about maximizing performance. And that means we're going to evidence it this way. And here's what we're going to call a win, and here's what we're going to call a loss, And when we see things that go wrong, here's how we're going to act. And if you see us deviating from what we just laid out, you should call us hypocrites and get angry about it. But otherwise, this is the plan. This is the plan. Maybe we're going to have a referendum or a consultation on this plan, right? We are going to get authorization that makes clear this is the road we're going down, and we are just going to all see together what happens, right? And in some ways, making things more visible is my answer here too, Vincent, right? I have a friend named Vanessa Williamson, who's at Brookings Institution, right? Who likes to talk about the submerged state, yeah? We very often hide the benefits of the state and show only its flaws, right? Which, I suspect some of you have dating profiles. Feels like a bad strategy, right? You don't want to take pictures of your bad side. You want to take pictures of your good side, That's why you set up the filters that way, is my understanding again. So, I think we do have a problem that we've started calling the state anything that we don't like, and thinking in a much more personalized way about anything we do. And, I think we've seen media stories over the past few weeks, past few months, of people saying, no, I didn't mean that thing should go away. I voted for this guy, but that's not what I meant to get rid of. It's the stuff I didn't like, not the stuff I like. And I think making it clear it's a bundle, that's part of why, and I really appreciate the kind of words on this, Don. It's part of why I keep bureaucrats in the title, because bureaucracy is far from perfect, right? But if we make bureaucracy only the things we don't like, we will forget all the reasons we need it, all the reasons it makes our lives better, and we'll continue to if we let it.
So that now you've sort of inspired me with a comeback here, which is, so partly we have these operating theories of if we can make better experiences, people will recognize, acknowledge, and respond to those if we make government work better. But we also consume our impressions of government through our media. And I think this is a hypothesis, right? Whether it's possible in a state like West Virginia that is really dependent on federal funding for people to recognize, boy, things have gotten a lot worse because the government has started to pull back on some of those supports that we depend on. When most of the folks who go out to vote in West Virginia are also voting for President Trump, presumably also consuming a media that tells them that government is at odds with their interests. And I don't know what wins in that contest. I do know when people lose stuff, they get very upset about that. So loss aversion is real and powerful. But whether there'll be a real moment of civic re-education where people start to learn what was lost was actually pretty useful and important to me. So we're in a giant experiment about what's going to happen. Speaking of experiments, I think you mentioned test and learn. That, to me, implies the idea that bureaucrats have some permission to try stuff.
Exactly.
So there's a rhetorical permission structure that's in place. And then we figure out what the evidence is. And you need both. You need the permission, but you also need the evidence.
Couldn't agree more.
And so if you sort of tear out the evidence collecting part of the business, right, and the US government is not always great about collecting evidence on its innovations, but if you reduce attention to research about interventions and policies, it's going to become a lot more difficult to make the case for either changing things or keeping things as they are. And so I think that is also part of what's essential here, is making sure we have structures of evidence where you say, okay, you're going to innovate and do amazing things, fine, but show us the evidence so that we can be persuaded that it's actually an improvement, or that we can decide to try something else instead.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more, Don. And let me say, this is less true in America, but in a lot of places that evidence frame is also a scaffolding that keeps the reform going, right? Mm-hmm. If you're somewhere, I know of a project in Punjab, in Pakistan, where, halfway through, the relevant principal secretary was shifted, and the new principal secretary wanted to cut the reform. It was a classic situation, right? To which, the people running the effort said, of course, you are the principal secretary, you get to decide. However, we are in partnership with this international university, which will not listen to you. And if you cut the reform, they will have the data of what happened during the reform period and what happened after the reform period. And who knows? Maybe that will work well for you. Maybe it will work less well. And guess what? That reform continued, right? And so evidence is not just about learning, right? I think in the Better Government Lab, one of the real powers of things like the Better Government Lab that I'm honored to be a part of, which Don founded, co-founded, is the ability to create a framework that can help sustain, that can help at the margin, can't guarantee it, but at the margin, it can make the chances that we actually get the innovation through and we get to see what the results of it just a bit more likely. It's one of the wonderful things places like the Ford School can do.
I think that's a really good place to end on. So if you would, please join me in thanking Dan for visiting with us today and for his work. And look for other events at the Ford School that we are organizing. We have a couple left this semester. Take care. Thank you for coming.